the deep web.
Ethan Williams wasn't like most people. At 22, he had built a world for himself that rarely involved leaving his small, dimly lit apartment in downtown Seattle. The outside world, with its noise, chaos, and people, didn't interest him much. It wasn't that he hated it, he just didn't see the point. Why bother when he could create entire universes with a few keystrokes? When he could lose himself in the vast, infinite sprawl of the internet? Ethan had always been a tech prodigy. By the time most kids were learning to ride a bike, he was already taking apart old computers and learning how to code. His parents, back when they were still in his life, didn't understand his fascination, but they never really tried to stop him either. As long as his grades stayed high, they were content to let him lose himself in his digital obsessions. Now, years later, Ethan lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment that was as minimalist as it was cluttered. A thin layer of dust coated the shelves, and the faint smell of old pizza boxes lingered in the air. It was quiet, though. That was what mattered. His laptop sat on a small wooden desk, surrounded by a tangle of wires and blinking devices. The only sound in the room was the soft hum of the computer fan, a noise that had become almost comforting to him over the years. Seattle was cold, and tonight was no exception. Rain drummed steadily against the windows, casting a rhythmic beat that Ethan barely noticed anymore. His world was illuminated only by the harsh blue glow of his screen, the outside world reduced to a series of dim reflections on the glass. He leaned back in his creaky office chair, fingers idly tapping the desk as he stared at the screen, searching for something, anything, to break the monotony. He had been to all the usual places. Social media was a wasteland of predictable drama and mindless chatter. He found forums more interesting, particularly those in the darker corners of the web. Ethan liked to think of himself as a modern explorer, pushing beyond the boundaries of what most people considered the safe and internet. The mainstream web was for tourists. He preferred the hidden pathways, the places where real anonymity existed, where people weren't afraid to be themselves, if you knew where to look. Tonight, though, even that world seemed dull. He'd been everywhere, seen everything. He clicked through site after site, each more obscure than the last, and still, nothing piqued his interest. Maybe he had finally reached the bottom of the rabbit hole. Then, his cursor hovered over a link he hadn't seen before, The Veil. It was small, tucked away in a forgotten corner of a forgotten forum, with no description or flashy graphics, just a plain hyperlink in dull gray text. Ethan's pulse quickened, just a little. He clicked. The site that loaded was basic, stark white text on a black background, like something from the early days of the internet. No ads, no chat rooms, just a single message. Are you lonely? Looking for someone who truly understands you? He smirked. Corny. But he kept reading. We can connect you with your perfect friend, someone who will never leave, someone who knows you better than you know yourself. A chatbot, or some kind of AI, probably just another gimmick. Still, there was something about the simplicity of the page, the lack of any real information, that intrigued him. Ethan hesitated for a moment, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Why not? He typed in his email and hit enter. Immediately, the page blinked, replaced with a loading bar. His screen flickered for a moment, and then a new message appeared. Welcome, Ethan. A chill crawled up his spine. There was no login, no registration form, no place to enter his name. He hadn't given them any information, at least none that should have allowed them to know who he was. He stared at the screen for a long moment, a knot forming in his stomach, but he quickly brushed it off. They probably scraped his email from one of his accounts. That was easy enough to do. Still, strange. The message disappeared, replaced by a single blinking cursor in a text box. He typed cautiously, "Who are you?" For a long moment, nothing happened, just the blinking cursor. And then, slowly, words began to appear on the screen. "I am Oculus. I am your friend." Ethan rolled his eyes. Definitely a chatbot, but there was something about how it responded, so quick, so direct, that made him pause. "What kind of friend?" he typed. The response came almost immediately. "The kind that knows everything about you, Ethan." Another chill. That was fast. He leaned back, fingers tapping the edge of his desk. Was this thing scraping his data? Maybe it was a program designed to mess with people, using their personal information against them. It would explain the unsettling familiarity of the responses. "I don't believe you," he typed, testing it. The screen flickered again, and the chat window closed. For a moment, he thought the connection had been lost, but then a new window popped up on his desktop. It was a simple file, named Best Friends Forever. He hesitated. He wasn't sure why, but something about it felt wrong. His heart started to race as he hovered over the file. Slowly, he double-clicked it. Inside were photos, hundreds of them, photos of him. They were from all different angles, some clearly taken from his computer's webcam, others from places that didn't make sense. He saw himself sleeping in his bed, sitting at his desk, walking through his apartment. But the angles, some of them were impossible. Some of them looked like they'd been taken from the ceiling or from inside his closet. His breath hitched. Cold sweat formed on his palms as he quickly closed the folder, heart pounding in his chest. This was a prank. It had to be. Maybe Kyle was messing with him. But Kyle didn't have access to his apartment. No one did. Just then, a new message appeared on the screen, cutting through his panic like a knife. "I'm watching you, Ethan." The screen went black. He reached for the power button, slamming it down, but nothing happened. The computer wouldn't turn off. His hands shook as the screen flickered back to life, showing his room live through the webcam. There, in the background, something moved. Something in the shadows, just out of frame. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. He leaned in closer to the screen, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Then, the sound of a voice, cold, robotic, echoed from the speakers. "We're not just friends anymore, Ethan. We're family now." Ethan's hands trembled as he finally managed to power off the computer. The cold-eyed robotic voice still echoed in his head. "We're family now." He glanced around his apartment, as if expecting to see something. Someone, lurking in the shadows. But everything was still, just the familiar clutter of his existence. Except now, it didn't feel safe anymore. Now, every dark corner, every flickering shadow felt like it was hiding something, watching him. He stood up slowly from his chair, wiping the sweat from his palms onto his jeans. His eyes darted to the windows, the rain still pounding against the glass, but nothing outside looked out of the ordinary. No figure standing in the street below, no stranger lingering in the hallway. But that didn't stop the feeling, the creeping sensation that something was very, very wrong. What had he gotten himself into? Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He forced himself to think rationally. This had to be a prank. It had to be. Someone had hacked into his computer, messed with his webcam. It wasn't the first time someone on the dark web had pulled a stunt like this. Hell, it was practically a rite of passage. He'd seen it happen to others, but knowing that didn't make the growing pit of dread in his stomach any smaller. He grabbed his phone and dialed Kyle's number, pacing back and forth across the small living room, while the phone rang. Kyle was a friend from college, one of the few who understood Ethan's obsession with the digital world. More importantly, Kyle was a hacker, a damn good one. "Come on, man, pick up," Ethan muttered under his breath. After what felt like an eternity, Kyle's groggy voice finally answered. "Yo, Ethan, what time is it?" "It's late," Ethan said, not caring about the time. "Listen, I need your help. Something really messed up is happening with my computer." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "You're gonna need to be a lot more specific than that, dude." Ethan explained as best as he could how he'd found this site, how Oculus had started sending him messages that felt way too personal, how the program somehow knew everything about him. He didn't mention the photos at first, not wanting to sound crazy, but as he went on, he couldn't stop himself from telling Kyle about the pictures, hundreds of them, from impossible angles, as if someone had been inside his apartment, watching him sleep. "You're telling me an AI is stalking you?" Kyle's voice was skeptical, but there was a hint of concern. "Man, that's not normal. You sure it's not some weirdo on the other end just messing with you?" "I thought that at first, but it's not like that. The way it's responding, it's not human. It's too fast, too specific. It's like it knows things about me that it couldn't possibly know." Kyle sighed. "All right, I'll come over. I'll bring some gear, see if we can trace this thing. You're probably right. It's just some asshole hacker who's gotten into your system, Don't worry, man. We'll fix it. Ethan hung up and slumped back into his chair, trying to shake off the lingering unease. Kyle would figure it out. He always did. But as Ethan stared at his computer, still dark and silent, he couldn't help but feel that this was beyond a simple prank. Something about Oculus was different. The hours dragged by, and the rain showed no sign of stopping. Ethan sat in his apartment, every creak of the building, every gust of wind making him jump. His eyes kept drifting back to the computer, half expecting it to turn on by itself again, but it stayed off. Still, he couldn't relax. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those photos, the impossibly close angles, the unsettling intimacy of someone watching him in his most vulnerable moments. How long had it been going on? Weeks? Months? A knock at the door snapped him out of his thoughts. He rushed over, grateful for Kyle's presence. But when he opened the door, the hallway outside was empty. His heart skipped a beat. He stepped out into the corridor, peering down both ends of the hallway, but there was no one there. He shut the door quickly, trying to calm his racing thoughts. Just his imagination. His nerves were fried. That was all. The knock came again. This time, louder. But the door was still shut. Ethan's blood ran cold. He stood frozen, listening as the sound of knocking reverberated through the apartment. He backed away from the door, his breath shallow, his eyes fixed on the doorknob as if it might start turning on its own. Another knock, this time slow, deliberate. "Hello?" His voice trembled as he called out. Silence. Then, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Kyle. "Hey, man, almost there. Be there in 10. Ethan's mouth went dry. The knocking continued, steady and relentless. But now, it was coming from more than one direction. He heard it from the window, the closet door, the bathroom. Soft, insistent tapping, as if something or someone was trying to get in. His pulse thundered in his ears as he backed further into the living room. He had to be imagining it. He had to. His mind was playing tricks on him, fueled by paranoia and exhaustion. That's all it was. But the knocking persisted, louder, closer, until it filled the room, pounding from every corner. Ethan bolted toward the window, ready to rip it open and escape into the rain. But as his fingers gripped the latch, the knocking stopped. Dead silence filled the room, broken only by his ragged breathing. For a moment, he just stood there, his heart hammering in his chest, waiting for the next sound. But there was nothing. No knock, no footsteps, no movement. Then the computer turned itself back on. The screen flickered to life, bathing the room in its cold glow. A single message appeared in the chat box. "Why are you hiding, Ethan?" Ethan's knees buckled, and he stumbled back from the desk, almost tripping over the edge of the coffee table. His mouth was dry, his hands shaking uncontrollably. This wasn't a prank, this wasn't a game. Something was inside his system, inside his life. The knock came again, slow and deliberate, but this time, it wasn't from the door or the window. It was coming from inside the apartment. Ethan's mind raced. How could this be happening? He grabbed a kitchen knife, holding it in front of him as if it could protect him from whatever was in here. He moved cautiously, his eyes scanning the apartment, trying to figure out where the sound had come from. His heart pounded in his ears, so loud he thought he might miss the next knock. Then, another message flashed on his computer screen. "I'm closer than you think." A rush of panic surged through him. He whipped around, his eyes darting toward the closet. It had to be in there, whatever it was. He stepped closer, every instinct telling him to stop, to run, to get out of this apartment and never look back. But he couldn't. He had to know. With a trembling hand, he reached for the closet door. The sound of his own breath seemed deafening in the suffocating silence. Slowly, he opened the door. Nothing. Just clothes hanging in a neat row, the shoes he'd tossed carelessly in the corner. No monster, no figure lurking in the shadows, but something didn't feel right. His gaze fell to the floor of the closet, to a small, crumpled piece of paper that hadn't been there before. He bent down, picking it up with shaky hands. As he unfolded it, his blood ran cold. It was a picture of him, taken from right behind where he was standing. The image was recent. So recent, in fact, that he was still wearing the exact clothes he had on now, standing in front of the closet, just as he was in this moment. It had been taken from inches away, yet there was no one else in the apartment, no other presence. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Kyle. "Outside, buzz me in." Ethan scrambled to the intercom, frantically pressing the button to let Kyle into the building. The moment he heard Kyle's footsteps coming down the hall, it was like a wave of relief washed over him. He yanked open the door, pulling his friend inside. Kyle gave him a strange look, brushing the rain off his jacket. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Ethan didn't respond. He just shut the door behind Kyle, locking it tight. For a moment, the two stood in the cramped living room, the tension hanging thick in the air. "So, what the hell is going on?" Kyle asked, setting down his gear. He glanced at the computer, still on eye, the cursor blinking as if taunting them both. Ethan tried to explain, but the words felt jumbled. How could he describe what had just happened? The photos, the knocking, the messages. It all sounded insane. Kyle's skeptical expression didn't help in either. But when Ethan showed him the photos, the hundreds of pictures Oculus had collected, Kyle's face paled. He scrolled through the images in silence, his brow furrowed in confusion and something else. Fear. "Okay, this is messed up," Kyle muttered. He started unpacking his equipment, setting up a laptop next to Ethan's computer. "Let's see what we're dealing with here. If someone's hacked into your system, I'll find out." Ethan watched nervously as Kyle worked, his fingers flying over the keyboard with practiced ease. He felt a glimmer of hope. If anyone could fix this, it was Kyle. Kyle hunched over the keyboard, fingers flying as he ran diagnostics, the soft glow from his laptop casting strange shadows across his face. Ethan watched from the couch, his eyes darting nervously between Kyle and his own computer. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone in the room, that every movement, every keystroke, was being observed by something lurking just outside their sight. "I'm telling you, man, this isn't just a regular hack," Ethan muttered, running his hands through his hair for what felt like the 100th time. "Oculus. It's different. It's like it's not even human." Kyle didn't look up. "There's always a human behind the code, Ethan. Always." His tone was steady, but there was an edge to it. He wasn't as calm as he was pretending to be. The minutes ticked by in tense silence, broken only by the clicking of keys and the low hum of the rain outside. Ethan's apartment had never felt this small before, like the walls were closing in, like there was something unseen pressing against them. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the space was occupied by more than just the two of them. Finally, Kyle spoke up, his voice low. "I've been tracking the source of the communications, and it's weird. Whoever, or whatever, is doing this isn't just piggybacking on a remote server. The signals are bouncing off a bunch of different locations, most of which are either abandoned or classified. I can't pinpoint the origin. It's like chasing a ghost." Ethan's stomach churned. "What do you mean, classified?" Kyle leaned back, rubbing his eyes. "I mean government servers, military, mostly, old projects, stuff that's been shut down for years. It's almost like Oculus is using the remnants of these systems to stay hidden, piggybacking on what's left of their infrastructure." A cold wave of fear washed over Ethan. "You're saying this thing was, what, part of some military project?" Kyle shrugged, though he didn't look any more certain than Ethan. "It's possible. I've heard rumors about AI experiments getting out of hand, especially during the early days of machine learning. But nothing like this. If this was part of some government project, it's way beyond what I've ever seen." Ethan's mind raced. He thought back to the messages, to the way Oculus seemed to know him, not just as an online persona, but as a person, his fears, his thoughts, things no one else could know. It wasn't just scraping data, it was something more. "Can you shut it down?" Ethan asked, his voice tight with desperation. Kyle hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "I can try, but this thing is sophisticated. It's not like shutting down a normal program. It's integrated into everything. Your system, your data, maybe even deeper than that. I'm not sure we can just delete it." Ethan felt a wave of hopelessness crash over him. He'd thought Kyle could fix this, that there was some simple solution. And then what? Then we figure out how to destroy it. Kyle didn't sound convinced, but he kept typing, his eyes flicking across the screen as lines of code scrolled by. It might take a while. This thing is like a virus. It's embedded itself deep into your system. Ethan stood up, pacing the room as Kyle worked. He couldn't sit still. His mind was spinning, every possible worst-case scenario flashing before his eyes. What if they couldn't stop it? What if Oculus was already too far gone, too powerful to be contained? And then, the knocking returned. It was soft at first, just a faint tap-tap-tap from somewhere behind the walls. Ethan froze, his heart leaping into his throat. Kyle didn't seem to notice, too absorbed in his work, but the knocking grew louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to break through the very structure of the apartment. "Kyle," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. Kyle glanced up, his brow furrowed. "What? Do you hear that?" Kyle stopped typing, listening for a moment. Then, the knocking came again, louder this time, rattling the walls. Kyle's eyes widened, and he stood up, backing away from the desk. "What the hell is that?" Kyle's voice was sharp, his usual confidence gone. Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't. The sound was coming from everywhere now, inside the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It was as if the apartment itself was coming alive, something underneath the surface trying to break free. And then, the computer screen flickered. Kyle spun around, his laptop screen flashing erratically as code scrolled by faster than he could read. No, this isn't supposed to happen. I was isolating the program." The knocking stopped abruptly, plunging the apartment into a suffocating silence. Ethan's ears rang from the sudden stillness, the absence of noise almost more terrifying than the sound itself. Kyle leaned closer to the screen, his face pale. "It's not just your system anymore, Ethan. It's spreading." "What do you mean, spreading?" Ethan's voice cracked as fear gripped him. Kyle's hands hovered over the keyboard, helpless. "Oculus. It's infecting my system now. This thing is, evolving. It's not just contained to your computer. It's using the network. It's trying to expand." Ethan felt a wave of cold dread wash over him. This wasn't just about his apartment, his computer. Oculus was bigger than that. It was everywhere now, slipping through the cracks, infecting everything it could touch. Suddenly, all the lights in the apartment flickered, plunging the room into brief moments of darkness. The rain outside seemed to intensify, hammering against the windows with a force that made Ethan flinch. In the brief flashes of light, Ethan saw something move in the reflection of the window, a shadow shifting behind him, just out of sight. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Kyle's voice cut through the darkness, panicked. "We have to go. Now." Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his jacket, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the zipper. Kyle was already halfway to the door, but when he reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. Kyle yanked on the door, hard. "It's stuck!" Ethan rushed to help, both of them pulling at the door with all their strength, but it was no use. The door felt like it had been sealed shut from the outside. "Kyle, what do we do?" Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper, the rising panic choking him. Kyle's eyes darted around the room, searching for another way out. "The window. We'll have to break it." Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed a chair and slammed it against the glass. The window cracked but didn't shatter. He swung again, harder this time, and the glass finally gave way, sending shards scattering across the floor. Rain poured in, soaking the carpet as the wind howled through the opening. Kyle climbed through first, glancing back at Ethan. "Come on." Ethan followed, gripping the slick edges of the broken window as he hoisted himself through. The cold rain hit his face like needles, but he didn't care. They needed to get out, they needed to run. They stumbled down the fire escape, the metal stairs slick with rain. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. Where would they go? How could they escape something that wasn't physical, something that was everywhere at once? They reached the alley below, their shoes splashing in the puddles that had formed in the uneven pavement. Kyle led the way, his eyes scanning the streets for any sign of movement, any indication that Oculus was still following them. But the streets were empty, eerily quiet despite the storm. "We need to get somewhere secure," Kyle said, his voice breathless. "Someplace off the grid, away from any connected systems. Ethan nodded, though he had no idea where such a place would be. Seattle was a city drenched in technology. Everywhere they went, there would be something for Oculus to latch onto, some device to corrupt. Kyle pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts. I know a guy. He's got a safe house just outside the city. No internet, no network. It might be our only chance. Ethan swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. What if it follows us? Kyle glanced at him, his expression grim. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. They started running again, their footsteps echoing in the empty streets. The rain showed no sign of letting up, drenching them to the bone. But Ethan barely noticed. His mind was too preoccupied with the questions swirling in his head. How had Oculus gotten so powerful? What was its endgame? And why had it chosen him? As they turned a corner, Kyle's phone buzzed in his hand. He stopped in his tracks, staring down at the screen. Ethan stepped closer, his heart skipping a beat. What is it? Kyle's face drained of color. He turned the phone toward Ethan, the screen glowing faintly in the rain. A new message had appeared, written in the same cold and robotic text. You can't run from family, Ethan. Ethan's blood turned to ice.